When the masks fall, the truth doesn't whisper, it roars. Chosen ones, let me tell you something that will shake you. Studies show that the average human lies multiple times a day. But what happens when those lies aren't harmless, when they're carefully crafted agendas built against your very destiny? Here's the twist. God doesn't just observe, he exposes. And when he exposes, it isn't in slow motion. It's in high-definition clarity that leaves no room for denial. For years, they thought they were slick operators running a chess game behind the scenes. In their minds, you were the pawn, the easy piece to sacrifice. But what they didn't calculate is that heaven was watching every sneaky move, every whispered plan, every backroom conversation. And now, the game board has flipped. Their secret strategies have turned into public spectacles, and the very traps they set for you are now their own embarrassing documentaries. Think of it this way, it's like someone trying to keep a diary of all their mischief, only to find out that God went ahead and published it on the front page for the world to read. And let's be honest, some of them are probably wishing right now that the ground would open up and swallow them whole. This isn't just exposure, this is justice in real time, raw, unfiltered, undeniable. And you, the chosen one, are standing in the center of the revelation, not as the victim, but as the living evidence that no hidden agenda survives the light of God. Now buckle up, because what I'm about to break down will not just make you nod in agreement. It'll make you laugh at how pathetic their schemes really were, and marvel at how thoroughly God has served them their own medicine. Number 1, the invisible ledger appeared. The invisible ledger appeared is not a poetic line. It is the brutal accounting of every slight, every calculated smile, every favor traded for silence being listed in cold, undeniable detail. Small acts that once felt private, a deleted message, an offhanded comment meant to shift blame, a helpful referral that was really a setup, begin to show up as entries, timestamps, witnesses, patterns. Those entries don't need dramatics. They are ordinary things collected and aligned until a pattern becomes obvious. That ledger doesn't judge with melodrama, it only records, and records have a way of doing what secrets could not, turning reputation into paper, then into proof. When people scroll through the receipts, what looked like character becomes choreography, and the choreography reveals intent. The ledger is merciless because it doesn't rely on feelings. It relies on evidence, messages, bank transfers, meeting notes, contradicted statements, silent absences when you needed help. Each line is small on its own, but together they outline a strategy. That strategy is what changes history, because history prefers documents over rumors. The moment those lines are arranged into a readable sequence, allies stop guessing and start choosing. The ledger forces conversations that were always avoided because it replaces opinion with trace. The exposed ledger also has an odd effect on the exposed: panic. People who once felt secure because their machinations were buried now realize that security was an illusion built on messy human details. Panic leads to mistakes, and mistakes make the ledger more complete. Attempts to rewrite entries create contradictions that become new entries. The more they try to tidy up, the more the ledger fills itself. For you, the chosen one, the ledger is a vindication engine. Your truth does not need to be loud, it needs to be consistent, and the ledger rewards consistency. Your ordinary actions, steady honesty, predictable boundaries, clear records of your own, become the contrast that highlights their irregularities. In the days after the ledger appears, institutions and communities that once tolerated covert games are suddenly dealing with transparent data. Rules are enforced, privileges revoked, apologies issued that no longer taste sincere. The ledger doesn't seek revenge, it demands accountability. That demand reshapes relationships and reallocates power. The invisible accounting is simply the universe insisting on balance, but done in a way that cannot be ignored. Methodically, evidentially, and finally. Number 2, their stories began to unravel into evidence. Their stories began to unravel into evidence the moment truth refused to stay buried. For a long time, they were confident that their version of events would stick. They carefully rehearsed the lies, cut out the inconvenient details, and leaned on their alliances to keep the story airtight. But stories have a fragile quality. They need maintenance, repetition, and silence to survive. Once a single contradiction slips through, the entire structure starts to sag under its own weight. What once sounded polished begins to sound rehearsed. What once convinced others starts raising suspicion. Every repeated line becomes less persuasive and more incriminating. The unraveling doesn't happen in one dramatic collapse. It happens piece by piece. A forgotten message surfaces. A timeline doesn't match. An alibi is broken by a casual witness who didn't even know they were holding critical information. Suddenly the story no longer stands alone. It requires patches, corrections, and adjustments. Those patches don't make the story stronger. They make it look desperate. The more energy poured into defending it, the more obvious it becomes that something is wrong. A lie can only survive when it is simple. The moment it grows complicated, the truth starts peeking through the seams. For you, the unraveling is both painful and liberating. Painful because you realize just how much effort went into scripting your downfall. Liberating because those efforts are collapsing without you needing to force it. The stories that painted you as unreliable, weak, or unworthy begin to serve as evidence of the speaker's own intent. Every word used to attack you is now a thread being pulled out of the fabric they sewed. What was once presented as your shame is now their documented strategy. This transformation of story into evidence is irreversible. Once a lie is exposed, it cannot be repaired to its former strength. Even if people try to cling to it, the seed of doubt has already been planted. Their confidence disappears, their credibility crumbles, and the audience that once believed them becomes cautious. The unraveling is not just about proving you right. It is about proving them incapable of holding the weight of their own deceit. That shift leaves them naked before the very people they wanted to impress, and it elevates your truth without you having to twist a single fact. Number 3, your pain became the map to their pattern. Your pain stopped being a private thing and became the most precise map available for reading their behavior. Each wound, each snapped promise, each moment you were sidelined lines up with other similar moments until what looked like random cruelty starts to show a design. Those moments cluster: the timing of attacks, the preferred language used to gaslight, the people they call in as backup, the rituals of exclusion. When you lay these instances side by side, the pattern emerges. Not as theory, but as a repeatable playbook they run whenever they want control. That map changes the narrative completely. Your suffering is no longer the lonely evidence of bad luck or a personal failing. It becomes a form of intelligence. It points to who benefits from your silence, who profits when you're small, and who engineered the context where your voice would be drowned. The disgrace they wanted to pin on you turns into a traceable trail that investigators, friends, and the wider community can follow. That trail shows motive, not just outcome. It reveals the architecture behind the cruelty. Coordination over coincidence, strategy over spontaneity. Because your pain is chronological data, it also allows verification. Independent accounts begin to mirror each other. Small details that once seemed trivial suddenly match up across different settings. What looked like one isolated incident becomes a series that proves intent. The people who followed their pattern for years are exposed not by one loud accusation, but by multiple quiet confirmations. That accumulation makes denial harder and deniability vanish. The shift in how people read events forces practical responses. Where before there were apologies with no change, now there are calls for structural reform, checks put in place to prevent the same pattern repeating, and relationships re-evaluated on the basis of demonstrated behavior rather than charisma or position. Your pain becomes a preventative manual for others. It teaches boundaries, where to push back, who to distance from, what questions to ask before trusting. On a personal level, this mapping turns your trauma into power. You become less reactive and more strategic because you've been given the blueprint of how they operate. You can anticipate moves, safeguard against recurring traps, and name the pattern out loud so it can't be dressed up again. In that way, your scars do more than mark what happened. They instruct the future. They make sure the next person won't walk the same map blindfolded. Number 4, karma stopped being a concept and began to be a mechanism. Karma stopped being a concept and began to be a mechanism when consequences moved from whispered threats to visible systems that actually change outcomes. This is not some mystical payoff, it's concrete. Contracts pulled, access revoked, privileges publicly stripped. Those who treated influence like an untouchable currency suddenly find that the banks are closing accounts and auditors are asking questions. When favors are recalled, it's not just social discomfort. It's the removal of practical supports. Introductions disappear. Endorsements are walked back. Sponsorships evaporate. That withdrawal is strategic and surgical. It's designed to cut off the oxygen their schemes depended on. People who built careers on invisible pipelines learn quickly that influence needs maintenance. Once institutions begin to enforce rules, the hidden scaffolding that held corrupt behavior collapses. Boards that once rubber-stamped decisions start demanding documentation. Contracts that were whispered about at fancy dinners end up being read under lights. The structural fallout is what terrifies them the most. When a system responds, it does so in ways that are hard to personalize away. A rescinded contract isn't a rumor you can charm your way out of. It's money and status removed in broad daylight. This mechanized karma also forces accountability beyond the individual. Organizations review who signed what, who benefited, and how oversight failed. That means risk assessments, policy changes, independent reviews, boring-sounding things that are fatal to secret deals. People who once navigated by favors and back channels now face standardized processes that don't care about charisma or charm. The rules favor transparency, and transparency is the opposite of what they relied on. The psychological effect is brutal and immediate. Those who profited from the old system feel exposed, not because they're morally guilty in some ethereal sense, but because the foundations of their power are literally being removed. Fear replaces arrogance, and fear makes people reckless. They make errors that feed the mechanism further. Meanwhile, communities and victims see practical results rather than symbolic gestures. Restitution negotiations, reinstated rights, and public disclosures that prevent repeat offenses. For you, this shift from poetic karma to functioning mechanism means justice becomes predictable and enforceable. It changes what people expect when wrongdoing is revealed. Instead of hoping for closure, you see procedures that deliver material correction. That certainty is dangerous to abusers because it strips away the cozy myth that power protects you indefinitely. The mechanism doesn't gloat, it executes. An execution, unlike rumor, shifts power, reallocates resources, and writes new rules for the future. Number 5. Witnesses shifted from fear to testimony. When witnesses move from fear to testimony, the whole hidden machine that protected abusers loses its fuel. People who once stayed quiet did it because silence felt safe, safer than rocking a boat that could sink their career, reputation, or relationships. But once the balance shifts and the risk of remaining silent outweighs the risk of speaking, those same mouths become a flood of confirmations. Testimony is not just words, it's a network effect. One person's truth loosens another's tongue, and what was once a handful of whispers becomes a chorus that authorities, communities, and the public can no longer ignore. The change is practical and immediate. When a former ally steps forward, they bring context, dates, names, behaviors, patterns. Those details make allegations verifiable instead of speculative. Investigators stop circling rumors and begin constructing timelines. Employers and institutions stop treating complaints as interpersonal problems and start treating them as systemic failures. The ripple from one brave voice often triggers formal inquiries, audits, and legal reviews that were previously considered impossible to open. Shifting from fear to testimony also exposes the social calculus that kept abuse hidden. People who defended the abuser because of loyalty, debt, or shared advantage suddenly face a moral and legal ledger. Silence now looks like complicity, and complicity carries consequences, formal sanctions, loss of credibility, and the social shame that follows being on the wrong side of history. That realization accelerates more testimony because nobody wants their name attached to cover-ups later. Another consequence is the erosion of plausible deniability. Abusers relied on ambiguity, conflicting accounts, private conversations, and he said, she said situations. Multiple testimonies collapse that ambiguity into a coherent narrative. Contradictions in the abuser's story become easier to spot, and half-truths no longer hold weight. The witnesses' combined accounts turn scattered incidents into a consistent pattern that institutions must address. For victims, witness testimony shifts the emotional landscape. Vindication arrives with practical benefits. Corroboration makes legal cases stronger, community support becomes tangible, and the pressure to prove every detail alone disappears. That support reduces isolation and prevents abusers from reasserting control through intimidation. Once witnesses start testifying, the support architecture that protected wrongdoing begins to fail fast. Relationships built on mutual protection crack, careers tied to silence unravel, and the social networks that sustained abuse dissipate. Testimony changes the system by replacing fear with records, isolation with solidarity, and secrecy with consequences. The moment witnesses choose truth over safety, the whole house of cards starts to fall. Number 6, their mirrors cracked first. They see themselves for the first time the way everyone else has been seeing them, and the sight breaks something. The polished reflections they used to project, confidence, control, competence, start to reveal cracks, hurried excuses, rounding of the truth, small betrayals that once looked like savvy moves. That first glimpse is destabilizing because their identity depended on the illusion of being untouchable. When the mirrors crack, it forces a rapid reassessment. Panic follows because they realize their brand wasn't built on substance but on concealment. Panic is dangerous in this context because it's noisy and obvious. Someone who once handled pressure with a smooth lie now stumbles, slurs, or doubles down with more lies. Those reactions are confessions by action. Trying to smooth over exposure with charm no longer works. Instead, the effort to control perception draws attention to the very inconsistencies they hoped would stay hidden. People watch for patterns, and panic creates patterns. Frantic calls, deleted messages, contradictory public statements that investigators and neighbors log like repeating beats on a metronome. Every hurried move becomes another fragment of proof. The psychological mechanics are simple. Their self-image depended on controlling narrative. Loss of control forces them into survival mode, and survival mode favors short-term fixes over long-term defense. That's why mistakes multiply. They cancel one commitment and forget to cancel another. They correct a lie publicly and then contradict it privately. They issue a half-hearted apology that contains a self-justification in the same breath. Those are not clever cover-ups. They are the involuntary tremors of someone who can no longer keep the act aligned. Another consequence is reputational feedback. When others see panic, trust evaporates quickly. Allies who once benefited from association start distancing themselves, not always out of virtue, but from self-preservation. The network that once absorbed small embarrassments now treats every slip as a liability. That withdrawal accelerates the collapse because isolation breeds poorer decisions and fewer people to advise soberly. Meanwhile, the exposed person misreads the moment as urgency rather than as consequence. Their haste to patch things becomes evidence of guilt. Attempts to reframe the narrative invite scrutiny because people naturally compare the old polish with the new panic and notice the differences. The mirrors cracked first because image control was always the fragile layer over a weak core. When that layer breaks, what remains is the raw pattern of behavior, and panic makes that pattern unmistakable. Number 7. You became the uncomfortable moral standard. You became the uncomfortable moral standard the moment your consistency exposed the gap between their words and their reality. They relied on appearances, speeches, gestures, public devotion, and scripted kindness to set themselves up as the moral compass in the room. But while they were curating an image, you were simply living. You didn't have to stage your choices. Your integrity showed up in small, repeated actions. How you handled conflict, how you kept your word, how you refused to trade truth for temporary advantage. That quiet authenticity has now become the measuring rod against which their performances look shallow. This dynamic is not about perfection, it's about credibility. They crafted reputations on borrowed virtue, but reputations without roots can't survive scrutiny. The more people compare your steady record with their curated facade, the more the contrast embarrasses them. Their inability to live up to the very standards they imposed on others creates a deep discomfort. That discomfort is magnified in public, where authority relies on recognition. They can no longer posture as the righteous one without someone recalling how you handled the same situation with more honesty and less noise. The shame doesn't come because you exposed them directly. It comes because your life makes exposure automatic. Their authority wilts when integrity becomes the standard, because integrity doesn't need applause or validation. It just holds. And while they can mimic rituals of goodness, they can't fake the fruit of it. Trust that grows naturally, respect that isn't demanded but offered freely, and loyalty that comes without coercion. These are things your presence creates, and they can't replicate them no matter how hard they perform. The public effect is destabilizing. Crowds once conditioned to respect the loudest voice start recognizing the quiet consistency in you as the true benchmark. That shift takes power away from people who depended on pageantry. The more they try to reassert themselves with louder declarations or forced displays of morality, the more hollow they appear beside you. It's not that you set out to compete. It's that your authenticity redefines what leadership, faith, or righteousness looks like in real time. And that's why you've become their discomfort. You are not just someone who survived their schemes. You're the walking contradiction to everything they built. You reveal by existing what they failed to embody by pretending. That silent but steady exposure is a shame they can't shake because the standard you represent isn't up for negotiation. Number 8, power rebalanced, not replaced. Power rebalanced, not replaced means the story doesn't end with one group falling and another taking their spot. That would only recycle the same old cycle of dominance, just with different names attached. What actually happens is more profound. The entire framework for who gets to speak, who gets heard, and who sets the narrative shifts. The privilege of controlling perception no longer belongs to a few smooth operators who bend truth to their advantage. Instead, reality begins to be defined by structures of accountability that don't bend as easily. This reset is uncomfortable because it forces a new kind of literacy. Those who thrived in shadows now have to function under lights, and many of them simply can't. They were never good at substance, only at strategy. When transparent rules become the measure, strategy alone is no longer enough. They need consistency, credibility, and verifiable proof. Without it, their positions at the table don't just shrink, they vanish. The seats don't stay empty either. They're filled by voices who can function under scrutiny, who are able to withstand being fact-checked and still stand tall. That's what makes this moment different. It's not about replacing one manipulative figure with another. It's about changing the environment so manipulation itself doesn't thrive anymore. Systems evolve, whether in families, institutions, or communities, and they stop rewarding silence, favoritism, or half-truths. They start rewarding transparency, reliability, and results that can be confirmed rather than claimed. The rules of engagement change, and suddenly the old tricks feel outdated and even laughable. For the chosen ones, this shift is vindication with permanence. Instead of waiting for the next storm of lies or the next cycle of sabotage, you find that the playing field itself is different. It no longer bends against you by default. The people who try to define you with distortions lose their grip because reality isn't theirs to script anymore. That power redistribution forces everyone to show their receipts, not just their rehearsed personas. The most unsettling part for those who once held sway is this: the door doesn't reopen for them. Once credibility collapses in a transparent system, it doesn't come back through charm or intimidation. It is gone for good. And that permanence means this reset isn't just your win. It's a restructuring of power that ensures fairness outlives the moment. Number 9. Their alliances began to fracture by interest, not loyalty. Their alliances began to fracture by interest, not loyalty, because exposure always tests the glue that holds relationships together. Many of the people who stood shoulder to shoulder with them weren't bound by shared values, but by shared benefits. They moved as a unit only because there was something to gain: influence, access, money, protection, or the illusion of power. Once the hidden agendas came into the light, that bond weakened instantly. The question each ally began asking wasn't, "Do I believe in this person?" but, "Is it still safe or useful for me to stand with them?" That shift is lethal to false alliances. When interest is the binding agent, it evaporates as soon as the cost of association rises. Nobody wants to go down with a sinking ship, and the ship sinks fastest when reputations are on trial. People who once defended them passionately start softening their language, distancing themselves, or even denying they were ever close. These cracks are not subtle, they're loud. The same voices that used to echo their lies suddenly fall silent, or worse, flip sides to save themselves. The beauty of this fracture is that it exposes truth in ways no argument ever could. You no longer have to guess who was genuinely for you and who was there for convenience. The unraveling separates wheat from chaff without you lifting a finger. Those who stood with them out of loyalty disappear quickly, while those who stood with you out of truth remain unshaken. It's a purification process. Only what is real survives. The collapse of these alliances also leaves them vulnerable in ways they never anticipated. They were used to being insulated. If one person faltered, another would cover. But when self-preservation takes over, nobody covers anyone. Each person scrambles for their own survival, often exposing more secrets in the process. The alliance becomes a liability instead of a strength, a circle of suspects instead of a wall of protection. For you, the chosen one, this moment brings clarity and release. You are no longer battling a crowd, you are watching a crowd battle itself. The masks fall not just from individuals, but from the entire network. What remains visible is who was truly aligned with you by principle, not by profit, and that kind of clarity is priceless because it means you never have to wonder again. Number 10. The legal and spiritual streams converged. When the legal and spiritual streams converged, accountability stopped being a private ache and became a public protocol. For years, people who harmed you could hide behind spiritual language, invoking forgiveness, destiny, or divine timing, to deflect responsibility and delay consequences. That space allowed abuse to be framed as mystery or fate, and it let systems of power shrug off basic demands for fairness. Once legal processes and spiritual clarity began to align, those defenses collapsed because two different logics started pointing at the same conclusion. Misconduct had real-world costs, and moral clarity demanded repair. This convergence changes how outcomes are decided. Legal mechanisms add enforceable remedies. Contracts can be cancelled, settlements negotiated, testimony recorded under oath, while spiritual reckoning brings community judgment, restorative practices, and moral accountability that law alone doesn't create. Together they form a two-track system that narrows escape routes. Where the law can strip titles or rescind privileges, spiritual reckoning withdraws social license and trust. The combination is decisive because it hits both the wallet and the standing that sustained abuse. Practical consequences follow quickly. Institutions begin to treat complaints with seriousness because the reputational cost is no longer abstract. Faith communities and leaders start asking for transparency because their integrity is at stake. Boards open investigations, not only to satisfy legal duty but to preserve moral credibility. Religious language stops being a shield and becomes a standard to measure behavior by. That shift makes reconciliation meaningful rather than performative. Apologies must be matched by concrete restitution and changed practices, not just flowery statements. For victims, the convergence provides a rare kind of closure. Legal validation confirms facts in a formal way, while spiritual acknowledgement restores dignity in a moral and communal sense. Together they replace isolation with both procedural support and communal recognition. This dual validation changes recovery. It gives victims the tools to rebuild materially and the community framework to heal socially and spiritually. For abusers, the moment is irreversible. The safety nets that relied on ambiguity and deference no longer hold. Legal exposure tightens the noose, and spiritual condemnation cuts off the social oxygen that once allowed them to operate. The result is a finality that feels inevitable. Systems respond, communities reckon, and privileges are recalibrated. When these streams meet, the aftermath is not a temporary spectacle, but a restructuring. It rewrites who gets to speak for morality and who must answer to law. That alignment doesn't seek vengeance. It enforces responsibility in both written code and communal conscience. And that double pressure turns reckoning into real, lasting change. Number 11. Your reputation became a shield and a weapon. Your reputation stopped being just a story people told about you and turned into a functioning defense. Years of steady behavior, small honest choices, and consistent boundaries accumulated into a record that could be pointed to when others tried to rewrite history. Instead of being cornered into refuting every accusation one by one, you simply leaned on a visible trail of conduct that made wild claims look ridiculous. That clear testimony, emails kept, promises kept, meetings documented, calm responses under pressure, became armor you didn't have to put on in a moment of crisis. It was already built into how people remembered you. That armor works in two ways. First, it blocks attempts to wound your credibility because accusations collide with a pattern that doesn't match them. When lies meet decades of predictable behavior, the lies lose traction fast. People who raise false narratives find themselves explaining why their version conflicts with a consistent record that others can verify. Second, your reputation becomes a weapon in the hands of truth. It allows you to push back without yelling because evidence carries weight where outrage only creates noise. A steady history disarms smears and allows institutions to respond quickly and decisively. The shift also changes how people approach you. Those who once sought to exploit your vulnerability now have to calculate the cost of dealing with someone whose track record is public and respected. That doesn't stop everyone, but it makes motives visible. People who come close with unclear intentions are easier to read because their behavior will either match or clash with the standards you live by. When someone's moves don't line up with your history, it shows up quickly and you can act before damage takes root. In that sense, reputation becomes a gatekeeper, not cruelly exclusionary, but practical and protective. There's a subtle social effect too. Allies and bystanders tend to rally faster around someone with a credible past. Support shifts from being emotional to being procedural, because institutions prefer to back people whose reputation is verifiable. That backing changes power dynamics. Your history invites others to trust in processes that protect you rather than leaving everything to personality contests. Finally, this reputation-turned armor flips the script on predators. They used to rely on ambiguity to manipulate. Now ambiguity works against them. Your consistent life makes uncertainty the enemy of their schemes. The end result is quiet but powerful. Your reputation doesn't just keep you safe. It reshapes how people behave toward you, exposes true motives, and turns credibility into both shield and strategic advantage. Number 12, silence was replaced by public accountability rituals. When silence no longer works, society replaces it with rituals of accountability. What used to be whispered about in private now unfolds in spaces where receipts, statements, and testimonies leave permanent marks. A forced apology in public isn't just about words. It's about stripping away the protective shield of secrecy. Suddenly, people who once laughed at consequences have to face processes that measure their actions, document the damage, and demand repayment. It's no longer enough to move on or keep the peace. The wrongs have to be formally acknowledged. These rituals don't emerge by accident. They show up because silence failed too many times. Every closed-door compromise that buried the truth created pent-up tension, and eventually that pressure forces systems to create visible responses. Evidence is displayed, confessions are written down, statements are read aloud. These steps may feel dramatic, but their weight is structural. They transform what used to be opinion into documented fact. Once it's written, filed, or recorded, there is no easy retreat. For those who once relied on charm, charisma, or manipulation, these accountability rituals feel like cages. They can't smile their way out or privately convince someone to let things slide. The process itself demands completion. The apology must be delivered. The evidence must be reviewed. The corrective action must be taken. This structure removes room for excuses and forces the abuser into a role they can't control, a subject of scrutiny rather than the author of their own spin. Another shift happens socially. Rituals make accountability communal. Where silence kept victims isolated, these public processes gather witnesses. Once an apology is issued in front of a crowd or evidence is displayed online, the community becomes the custodian of the truth. That makes backsliding harder. The crowd remembers. The record remains searchable. What was once hidden in private memory is now guarded by collective knowledge. And that collective knowledge is powerful. It changes incentives. Those who once looked the other way now calculate differently because ignoring a documented process means siding against proof. Being complicit suddenly costs more than it pays. Abusers find that the very stage they once dominated now works against them. The result is not just punishment, it's transformation. By replacing silence with ritualized accountability, systems train communities to recognize harm and demand repair automatically. This shift strips exploitation of its favorite disguise, secrecy, and ensures that the performance of justice becomes a structural barrier against repeat offenses. Number 13, freedom emerged as a side effect, not a goal. Freedom came in a way you never expected. Not as a prize handed to you, not even as something you were actively chasing, but as a natural consequence of everything collapsing around those who tried to control you. You weren't running after liberty. You were just trying to keep your head above water, to live without betraying yourself. That was the focus: honesty, survival, and holding on to the smallest thread of dignity while navigating through systems stacked against you. And then, almost quietly, freedom showed up. It wasn't a dramatic breakthrough moment. It wasn't about fireworks or someone declaring you free. Instead, it was the slow erosion of the structures that kept you boxed in. The lies lost credibility, the alliances holding them together fractured, and the endless manipulations became too exhausting for their own architects to maintain. What once seemed like a fortress turned out to be more like rotting scaffolding, sturdy looking from the outside but collapsing the moment truth started shaking its foundations. And in that collapse you discovered you had space to breathe. That space was freedom. What makes this kind of freedom different is that it isn't theoretical, it's practical. You don't celebrate it by making big speeches about liberty, you live it in small daily choices. You no longer have to check over your shoulder before speaking truth. You don't spend hours rehearsing defenses against accusations that never fit your character in the first place. You aren't performing to meet shifting demands of those who secretly resented your existence. That invisible weight lifted, and in its absence you realized you'd been carrying chains you didn't even recognize as chains. And here's the irony. Freedom was their nightmare, not yours. The ones who tried to orchestrate your boundaries assumed that keeping you tied up was necessary to preserve their advantage. When those ties broke, it wasn't just that you were freer, it's that they lost their grip. What they thought was control turned out to be dependency. Your survival without compromise exposed how fragile their power really was. So freedom wasn't the finish line you aimed for, it was the unintended side effect of exposure. The chains didn't snap because you yanked them, they fell apart because they were already rusting under the weight of truth. And now you walk lighter, not because you set out to win freedom, but because truth bulldozed the machinery that once kept you trapped. Number 14, a new precedent was established not for you alone. When exposure happens at the level you endured, it doesn't just resolve your story, it rewrites the conditions for everyone who comes after. That's the hidden power of precedent. It transforms a private battle into a public reference point, a benchmark against which future actions will be measured. Suddenly, it's not only about your vindication, it's about creating a record that predators and opportunists will have to weigh before they even think of trying the same tricks again. This kind of precedent is stronger than a single punishment. Punishment addresses one wrongdoer. Precedent shapes the decisions of countless potential wrongdoers. It becomes a living deterrent, a line in the sand, drawn by the exposure itself. The message is unmistakable. This is what happens when you cross these lines. And once that message is written into social memory, it can't be easily erased. What makes precedent powerful is that it multiplies over time. Institutions, communities, and even individuals look back at outcomes to decide their next moves. If your case showed that silence will collapse into testimony, that lies will unravel into evidence, and that manipulation will spiral into accountability, then the next person plotting will think twice. Not because they've suddenly developed morals, but because they can see the cost of getting caught has risen dramatically. Exposure is expensive and nobody wants to pay that bill. The irony is that the people who tried to destroy you accidentally became the warning label for everyone else. Their downfall is now a cautionary tale. Their names attached to the kind of consequences predators work hard to avoid. And though they might rage against that role, their legacy is sealed. They became the example. That's a kind of justice deeper than courtroom sentences. It's cultural justice, encoded into memory. For you, the precedent means you don't just walk away with your own freedom restored. You leave behind a safer terrain for others. Someone else will find their chains lighter because your battle redefined the boundaries. That ripple effect is bigger than any one victory. It's the system itself evolving, learning from exposure, and refusing to go back to the days when silence and charm could cover corruption. In the end, your story doesn't just close a chapter, it opens a new rulebook, and that rulebook will outlive every personality involved, making your reckoning not just personal triumph but structural change. The story of exposure, reckoning, and transformation is not just your story. It is a blueprint for how truth and integrity ultimately dismantle deception. Every hidden agenda, every false alliance, every whispered lie has been revealed, measured, and held accountable. The lies that were meant to bind you have unraveled, the manipulations designed to control you have fractured, and the power once wielded against you has been redistributed in ways that favor transparency and justice. Your integrity has become the standard that others are measured against, your scars the map that exposes patterns, and your consistent life the shield that protects while also revealing true motives. This isn't about vengeance, it's about inevitability. Systems react, structures adjust, and communities recalibrate when lies collide with evidence and when silence is replaced by accountability. Karma becomes a mechanism. Alliances fracture under the weight of exposure, and those who once sought to manipulate now find themselves exposed and panicked. Your survival and honesty have created more than personal vindication. They've established a precedent that protects the future, deterring predators and reshaping the rules for what will be tolerated going forward. Freedom emerges not as a goal, but as a natural consequence of truth taking its course. What once seemed like chaos or punishment is revealed as the divine orchestration of justice, measured, inevitable, and permanent. Your reputation, your testimony, and your unwavering moral standard have turned into tools that shield you, wield power, and redefine authority. The world has been forced to acknowledge reality on your terms, and in doing so, your story has become a template for structural change. This is the full scope of exposure. It humbles the arrogant, protects the innocent, and rewrites the game for everyone who comes next. You didn't just survive schemes and deceit, you turned them into a masterclass of accountability, power rebalancing, and inevitable truth. The impact doesn't end with you, it echoes far beyond, leaving behind a system where manipulation falters and integrity prevails. You are living proof that honesty, resilience, and courage don't just survive adversity, they redefine the rules entirely. If this breakdown resonated with you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join the community of chosen ones uncovering truth and reclaiming power. Smash the like button if you feel the impact of exposure and accountability. Drop a comment below to share your thoughts or experiences. Your voice matters and could inspire someone else. And don't forget to share this video with anyone who needs to see that integrity, truth, and courage always leave a mark. Every click helps spread the revelation, and together we keep rewriting the rules. God bless you.